Welcome to a story that will change the way you see success and family. Before we begin this emotional journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like. Let's dive right in. Edward Sterling was in the middle of a high-stakes business dinner when a tiny, high-pitched voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir." He turned around and saw a little girl with piercing, bright blue eyes looking up at him. She hesitated for a second, then pushed up her sleeve, revealing a birthmark on her wrist, a jagged star, entirely identical to his own. "My mom told me that if I ever found someone with this mark," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear, "he might be my dad." The world around Edward instantly faded to black. His past had just tracked him down, and that past had his exact same eyes. Edward Sterling was sitting in one of the most exclusive, astronomically expensive restaurants in Manhattan, a place where privacy was guaranteed and the service was flawless. The evening had been completely routine, just another business dinner, another multi-million-dollar merger in progress, another night where everything was going exactly according to his meticulous plans. He hadn't been paying close attention to the conversation at his table. His business partners were aggressively discussing market expansion and potential corporate acquisitions. But Edward's thoughts were miles away. He had built his empire on relentless discipline and cold strategy. But lately, he had begun to feel a strange, gnawing emptiness that he couldn't quite explain. He usually just wrote it off as exhaustion. Swirling the expensive vintage wine in his glass, he exhaled slowly, scanning the dimly lit, elegant restaurant with his sharp blue eyes. It was filled with the city's elite, politicians, A-list celebrities, and top-tier executives just like him. Everything in this place was familiar, predictable, and controlled. Until that tiny voice broke through the quiet hum of sophisticated chatter. "Excuse me, sir." Edward turned his head in genuine surprise. Standing right next to his table was a little girl, no older than 8. She had long, wavy blonde hair, framing a delicate face, and strikingly bright blue eyes that felt far too familiar. She was clutching a white linen cloth napkin in her small hands, nervously twisting it around her fingers. Edward frowned. It wasn't entirely unusual for wealthy families to bring their children to elite dining establishments, but there was something remarkably different about this girl. She was completely unaccompanied. He glanced around the room, fully expecting to see a panicked, apologetic parent rushing over to grab her, but no one came. "Are you lost?" he asked in an even, composed tone, though a hint of curiosity bled through. She hesitated before shaking her head. "No." "Where are your parents?" She hesitated again, shifting her weight, and then slowly extended her small arm toward him. And that was exactly when he saw it. The birthmark. Not just any random birthmark, but his birthmark. The exact same distinct shape, in the exact same place on the inner wrist, just like the one hidden beneath his tailored cuff. The breath caught sharply in his throat. The luxurious restaurant faded entirely into the background. The voices of the executives around him turned into a muffled blur. The little girl's blue eyes met his, searching, waiting. Then she spoke again. Her voice was quiet, yet entirely unwavering. "My mom told me that if I ever met someone with the exact same birthmark as Mia." I had to tell him. Edward's fingers tightened like a vice around the stem of his wine glass. His heart was hammering against his ribs. "Tell him what?" he asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She swallowed hard, taking a breath, and then whispered the words that completely shattered his reality. "That you might be my dad." Edward just stared at the girl. His grip on the glass tightened so much the crystal groaned. His brilliant, analytical mind was violently struggling to process what he had just heard. The words felt surreal, utterly impossible. His daughter? No, This had to be a mistake. A scam. He studied her face, desperately searching for something familiar beyond just the mark on her wrist, her blonde waves, her striking blue eyes. There was something undeniable staring back at him, a resemblance he absolutely could not ignore. The restaurant around him had become nothing more than distant static. The powerful men at his table had fallen dead silent, sensing that something highly unusual was happening, but Edward paid them zero attention. His entire focus, his entire world, was narrowed down to the little girl standing in front of him, waiting for an answer. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice lower now, dangerously controlled. The girl shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. She looked down at the twisted napkin in her hands, as if gathering her courage. "My mom told me that if I ever saw someone with this birthmark," she repeated, raising her tiny wrist again, "I had to tell him, because it could mean he's my dad." Edward took a deep, jagged breath, his mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. There was only one person on Earth who could have possibly told her that. "Who is your mother?" he demanded, even though the answer was already forming in his mind. The girl's lips pressed together for a fleeting second before she spoke. "Lily Valentine." The name hit him like a brutal punch to the gut. He hadn't heard that name in years, but it was a name he knew he would never, ever forget. Lily had once been everything to him. She was someone who had genuinely loved him, despite all his deep flaws and cold edges. But he had walked away. He had convinced himself that love, attachments, and a family would only anchor him down and hold him back. He had chosen blind ambition over her, and now, standing right in front of him, was the living, breathing consequence of that choice. Interactive question. Have you ever made a major life choice between your career and your relationships? Do you regret it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Edward pushed his heavy chair back and stood up, towering over the small child. His heart was racing frantically, but his face remained a masterclass in unreadable stoicism. "Where is your mom now?" The girl looked down at the floor. Her tiny fingers gripped the napkin so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She died last month." Edward's chest violently tightened. Lily was gone. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't allowed himself to think about her in just as long, and now he would never see her again. The crushing finality of that fact hit him much harder than he ever could have anticipated. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to calm down. He could not afford to lose control. Not here, not now. His sharp focus snapped back to the girl. His daughter. "What is your name?" he asked softly. She looked up at him. Her bright blue eyes were swimming with an emotion he couldn't quite pinpoint. "Amelia," she said quietly. The name echoed loudly in his mind, foreign, yet instantly belonging. Edward glanced around the restaurant. People at nearby tables were beginning to notice the strange scene. He refused to have this conversation in a room full of vultures. Under the intensely curious gazes of strangers, he looked back down at Amelia. "Come with me," he said in a firm but completely gentle voice. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second, before nodding. Edward placed a large, warm hand lightly on her small shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. His multi-million-dollar business dinner was officially over. His entire life had just been rewritten. Edward led Amelia out of the restaurant into the cool New York night. His mind was still spinning violently. The valet handed him the keys without a single question, and Edward opened the heavy door of his sleek black Maybach, gesturing for her to get inside. She hesitated for just a moment before climbing up into the massive leather seat, clutching the seatbelt with her tiny fingers as if she had no idea what to do next. He settled into the driver's seat, gripping the leather steering wheel tightly before risking a glance at her. She looked incredibly small engulfed in the luxurious passenger seat. Her blue eyes darted rapidly between him and the unfamiliar, opulent surroundings. "Where have you been living?" he asked, pulling out smoothly onto the busy avenue. Amelia shifted awkwardly in her seat. "With Mrs. Gable. She's our neighbor. She took me in after—" She trailed off, nervously picking at the hem of her dress. "But she said I couldn't stay forever." Edward exhaled sharply through his nose, his grip on the steering wheel turning white-knuckled. The horrifying thought that his daughter, his own child, had been left to the mercy of a neighbor after her mother's tragic death made something deep inside him twist in agony. Lily should have told him. He had a fundamental right to know. He forced himself to keep his voice perfectly level. "And before that, did your mom ever mention me?" Amelia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She said you were a very important man, that you were really busy. She said you had your own life to live." Edward's jaw clenched tight. He could practically hear Lily saying those exact words, softening the harsh, ugly truth so that Amelia wouldn't grow up harboring resentment for a father she had never even met. She still should have told him. He swallowed the bitter disappointment rising like bile in his chest. "Did she ever say why she didn't tell me about you?" Amelia shook her head. "No. She just said that back then you weren't ready." The words struck him much harder than he expected. He desperately wanted to argue, to deny it, but deep down in his soul, he knew it was the absolute truth. 8 years ago, he wouldn't have had the slightest clue what to do with a baby. Back then, he barely knew how to take care of himself, too ruthlessly consumed by building his empire to think about anything else. But now, sitting in the quiet luxury of this car with his daughter, everything felt profoundly different. "Want me to come with you?" Her voice was "want me to come with you." Her voice was incredibly quiet, terribly uncertain, and something in the vulnerable way she said it made Edward's stomach drop to the floor. "Of course I want you to be with me," he stated, his voice coming out much firmer and more fiercely than he had intended. Amelia's head snapped toward him, her blue eyes widening with an emotion he couldn't read. He cleared his throat, desperately trying to shake off the heavy, unfamiliar weight pressing painfully on his chest. "We will pick up your things tomorrow. Tonight, you're staying with me." She nodded simply, but didn't say another word. The rest of the long drive out of the city was enveloped in silence, but surprisingly, it wasn't an awkward one. Amelia sat quietly, watching the bright, passing lights of the city blur against her window, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. When they finally pulled up to his massive, ultra-modern estate, tucked away in the wealthy, quiet suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut, Amelia's mouth fell open slightly. "This is where you live?" she asked, her voice barely registering above a whisper. Edward briefly glanced at the sprawling mansion, its perfectly manicured, endless lawns, and the towering floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the soft, warm glow of the security lights. He had never really given it much thought before, but looking at it through her eyes, yes, it was incredibly massive and undeniably cold. It was a fortress explicitly designed for a man who never expected to share his personal space with a single living soul. "Yes," he said simply. Amelia stared at the house for a long moment before nodding. She didn't offer an opinion on whether she liked it or not. CTA. If you're hooked on Edward and Amelia's story, smash that like button to let the algorithm know. And don't forget to check the description for more stories. He got out of the car and walked around to open her heavy door. She climbed out slowly, her wide eyes still darting rapidly between him and the imposing architecture. "Come on," he said softly, placing a warm hand lightly on her upper back and guiding her toward the grand front entrance. When they stepped inside, the absolute silence of the mansion instantly swallowed them whole. The soaring high ceilings and massive open spaces that usually felt normal and empowering to him suddenly felt painfully empty and cavernous. Amelia took tiny, careful steps, looking around meticulously, as if she couldn't quite believe she was actually allowed to be standing there. "This place is huge," she finally observed. Edward let out a short, hollow breath. "I suppose it is." She turned to look directly at him. "Do you live here all by yourself?" He hesitated for a second before nodding. "Yes." Amelia studied his face for a long, calculating moment before looking around the grand foyer again. "It feels kind of quiet." Edward wasn't entirely sure why, but her innocent words settled heavily in his chest, making him feel incredibly restless and uneasy. He gestured toward the grand, sweeping staircase. "Come on, let me show you to your room." Amelia followed closely behind him up the carpeted stairs, her light footsteps barely making a sound. He led her into one of the main guest rooms, one of the many he possessed, though he had literally never used them. The room was utterly spotless. The king-sized bed was immaculately made, and the expensive decor was fiercely minimalist. It was highly functional, but entirely empty of life. Amelia stood frozen in the doorway, scanning the room. "It's nice," she offered politely, though there was zero genuine emotion behind the words. Edward was suddenly, violently struck by the realization of just how woefully unprepared he was for this exact moment. The room was nothing more than a space. There were absolutely no toys, no stuffed animals, no warmth, no colors, nothing that would ever make a child feel like it was her room. "We'll go buy you some things tomorrow," he said, speaking more to reassure himself than her. Amelia nodded slowly, then hesitated, biting her lower lip. "Can I ask you something?" Edward immediately turned to fully face her. "Of course." She looked up at him, her bright blue eyes dead serious, filled with a terrifying vulnerability. "Are you going to keep me?" His stomach contracted violently. "Keep you?" he repeated, genuinely thrown completely off balance by the tragic phrasing. Amelia shifted nervously. "Mrs. Gable said she wasn't sure where I would end up. She said you might not want me, because you didn't know about me before." Edward inhaled sharply, violently shoving down the sudden, crashing wave of raw emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I didn't know about you before," he said, his voice incredibly careful and deliberate. "But now that I do," he crouched down slightly, so he was completely eye-level with her. "You aren't going anywhere, Amelia." Her tiny fingers tightened their grip on the hem of her dress. "Do you promise?" He held her intense gaze without blinking. "I promise." For the very first time since they had left the restaurant, the rigid tension in Amelia's small shoulders slightly relaxed. She nodded, then let out a quiet, shaky breath. "Okay." Edward stood back up, silently watching as she bravely walked over to the massive bed and climbed under the heavy, expensive duvet. She looked impossibly tiny in the center of the huge mattress, but she didn't look terrified anymore. He turned to leave, but just before he reached the doorframe, he heard her tiny, high-pitched voice again. "Good night, Dad." Edward froze completely. His grip on the brass doorknob tightened until his knuckles ached. He had spent his entire adult life aggressively building a world where messy emotions had absolutely no place, where personal relationships were nothing but unnecessary, dangerous distractions. But now, in the span of a single night, the entire foundation of his universe had shifted. He turned his head slightly, his voice softer than it had ever been in his entire life. "Good night, Amelia." Then he flicked off the lights, pulled the door shut, and for the first time in decades, he profoundly realized he was no longer alone. Edward barely slept a single second that night. He had spent years micromanaging and controlling every single aspect of his existence: his massive company, his ruthless reputation, his rigid daily routine. But right now, all of that felt entirely irrelevant compared to the staggering fact that, in the very next room, his 8-year-old daughter was sleeping in a bed that didn't belong to her, in a house that was never, ever meant for a child. He sat in the dark in his lavishly appointed study, staring blankly out at the glittering panoramic view of the grounds through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The window perfectly reflected his own face, usually calculating, intense, and sharp. But beneath that mask, there was something entirely unfamiliar: crushing doubt. He had absolutely no idea what he was doing. For years, he had aggressively told himself that emotions were a fatal weakness, that personal attachments were a liability, that his empire was the only thing that actually mattered. But now, just down the hall, was a little girl who had lost her mother, who had spent agonizing weeks living in pure uncertainty, and who had looked him in the eye and asked with heartbreaking, devastating honesty, "Are you going to keep me?" Edward closed his eyes tightly, rubbing his throbbing temples. He hadn't even known she existed. He logically knew he should be furious at Lily for keeping the secret, for robbing him of the choice. But mostly, he was just violently haunted by the terrible thought of what Amelia must have gone through after losing her mom, waiting desperately for someone, anyone, to come get her, not knowing if anyone ever would. The thought of her feeling unwanted made his chest physically ache. At some point in the early hours of the morning, sheer exhaustion finally won, and he passed out in his leather desk chair. When he finally woke up, it was to the sound of very faint, hesitant movement just outside his study door. Edward bolted upright, dragging a heavy hand down his face before checking his expensive watch. It was almost 7 a.m. He had overslept, something that literally never happened to him. He quickly stood up and walked out into the massive hallway, finding Amelia standing near the grand staircase, peering quietly over the railing. She spun around when she heard his footsteps, her bright blue eyes widening slightly in alarm. "I didn't know where to go," she confessed, nervously shifting her weight. "I didn't want to wake you up." Edward hesitated, his brain still violently adjusting to the shocking reality of having someone else living in his house. "You can wake me up if you need to," he said, though his morning voice was rougher and harsher than he intended. Amelia studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Are you hungry?" he asked after an awkward pause. She nodded again. Edward wasn't exactly sure why he hadn't thought of food logistics earlier. He was totally accustomed to his private staff preparing his meals, or simply eating catered food at the corporate office. But today was entirely different. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the stairs. She followed him silently as they navigated down to the massive gourmet kitchen. The space was aggressively modern and sleek, outfitted with industrial stainless steel appliances and endless acres of cold marble countertops. It looked much more like a high-end designer showroom than a place where human beings actually lived. Amelia climbed up onto one of the tall leather bar stools at the central island, watching him intently. "Do you know how to cook?" she asked directly. Edward let out a short, self-deprecating breath. "Not exactly." Her lips pressed together tightly, as if she was fighting a smile. "Mom was a really good cook." He stopped in front of the massive Sub-Zero refrigerator, looking back at her over his shoulder. "What did she usually make for breakfast?" Amelia's tiny fingers traced invisible patterns on the cold marble. "Pancakes, mostly. She always said they were easy." Edward pulled open the heavy refrigerator door, scanning the neatly organized shelves. He spotted organic eggs, premium milk, and flour in the pantry. He could do this. He regularly closed billion-dollar acquisitions. He could absolutely handle making a simple pancake. He gathered the ingredients and set them on the counter, turning around to find Amelia watching him with blatant, open skepticism. "What?" he asked defensively. She shrugged her tiny shoulders. "You just don't look like the kind of guy who bakes pancakes." Edward raised an amused eyebrow. "And what kind of guy do I look like?" Amelia tilted her head, seriously considering the question. "Like a guy who drinks way too much coffee and eats food out of fancy cardboard boxes." Edward actually smirked, completely despite himself. It wasn't far from the truth. He turned his attention back to the mixing bowl, rigidly following a recipe he had hastily pulled up on his phone, doing the absolute best he could. Amelia rested her chin in her hands, clearly highly entertained by his clumsy efforts. As he carefully poured the lumpy batter into the hot, expensive skillet, she leaned forward slightly. "Don't flip it too early, or it'll tear," she warned. "Oh, so you're the expert." She nodded solemnly. "I watched Mom do it a lot." Edward glanced at her warmly. "Then you'll have to watch me closely so I don't ruin it." Amelia's blue eyes flickered with an emotion that was incredibly hard to read. He didn't fully realize just how much those simple words meant until he saw a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in her expression, a slight easing of the heavy tension she carried. The very first pancake was merely passable. The second one was marginally better. He confidently placed the plate in front of Amelia and set down a jar of expensive artisanal jam. She picked up her fork, took a small, careful bite, and chewed thoughtfully. "Well?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Not as good as Mom's," she declared honestly. Edward let out a low, genuine chuckle. "Expected." "But," she continued, taking another large bite, "it's not terrible." He mentally took that as a massive victory. They ate the rest of the meal in relative silence, but again, it wasn't awkward or strained. For the very first time since the moment he met her, Edward didn't feel completely, overwhelmingly out of his depth. When Amelia finally finished, she neatly set her fork down and looked at him with intense seriousness. "What happens now?" Edward exhaled slowly, setting down his black coffee. "Now, we figure things out." Amelia studied his face for a very long time. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Edward held her gaze steadily. "Yes." She seemed to deeply weigh his answer, then slowly, deliberately nodded. "Okay." Just one single word, but it meant absolutely everything. For the first time, she was cautiously allowing herself to believe that she actually belonged here. And Edward knew, without a single shadow of a doubt, that he was never going to let her down. Parenting is full of unexpected challenges. What was the most surprisingly difficult thing you had to learn to do for someone else? Let us know in the comments. The morning after their first breakfast together, Edward found himself navigating entirely uncharted territory. His entire existence had always been strictly governed by order, maximum efficiency, and absolute control. But now, roaming his massive house was an 8-year-old girl, a daughter he never knew existed, who had completely flipped his universe upside down in a matter of hours. Amelia moved through the giant house with extreme caution, as if she wasn't entirely convinced she was truly allowed to be there. She absolutely refused to touch anything unless explicitly told she could. She never asked for a single thing. She was remarkably quiet, incredibly observant, constantly watching him as if she was actively trying to figure out if he actually meant what he said about letting her stay. Edward genuinely didn't know how to handle it. He had spent his life ruthlessly negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, managing high-pressure corporate crises, and making impossible, split-second executive decisions. But this was vastly different. This wasn't business. This was real life. By mid-morning, he realized they had a very practical problem. Amelia had absolutely no clothes, no personal belongings, nothing whatsoever that made this giant, sterile house feel like a home. And so, for the very first time in his adult life, Edward Sterling found himself standing inside Saks Fifth Avenue. Amelia stood quietly beside him, her tiny fingers nervously gripping the strap of a small, cheap bag, as she stared up in absolute awe at the towering displays of designer clothing, shoes, and sparkling accessories. It was overwhelmingly massive. "Pick out whatever you like," Edward instructed, keeping his tone perfectly level and encouraging. Amelia hesitated, looking overwhelmed. "Anything?" "Yes." She bit her lip nervously, looking around again. Edward could clearly see the deep hesitation swimming in her eyes, the way she shifted her weight, as if she didn't fully believe his blank check offer. "I really don't need very much," she finally said. "You need enough," Edward countered gently. "We are absolutely not leaving here with just one single outfit." Amelia gave a tiny nod and began slowly walking down the wide, brightly lit aisle. She wasn't acting at all like the privileged children he usually saw in these luxury stores. There was zero frantic excitement, no running wildly from rack to rack, no impulsive grabbing of expensive items. She was incredibly cautious, highly thoughtful. She would gently pick up a few items, examine them very carefully, and then quietly put most of them right back on the rack. Eventually, she settled on one pair of sturdy jeans, a few simple shirts, a warm jacket, and one pair of practical sneakers. Edward frowned, looking at the meager pile. "Is that all?" Amelia nodded affirmatively. He sighed heavily. "We will buy more later." She looked up at him with an unreadable expression. "Why?" "Because you need things, Amelia," he stated simply. She studied his face for a long moment, then just nodded again. "Okay." After paying the exorbitant bill, they stopped at a massive, multi-story bookstore. Here, Amelia walked through the tall aisles with significantly more confidence. This time, her small fingers traced eagerly over the spines of the colorful books. Edward patiently let her take all the time she needed, silently watching from a distance as she meticulously selected exactly 3 books. He raised an amused eyebrow when she finally handed them to him. "Just 3?" She shrugged her small shoulders. "Books last a really long time." Edward exhaled, shaking his head, with a slight, fond smile. "We will come back, whenever you finish these." Amelia smiled, a real, genuine smile, for the very first time that entire day. Deal. The car ride back to the estate was quiet, but it was no longer an uncomfortable silence. She sat in the massive leather passenger seat, already flipping through the pages of one of her new books, occasionally stealing glances at him as if she desperately wanted to say something, but wasn't quite sure if she should. When they arrived back at the house, she immediately grabbed her heavy shopping bags and carried them inside, neatly lining them up at the base of the grand staircase. "You really don't have to do that," Edward told her. "I have staff who handle things like that." "I don't mind," Amelia interrupted quickly. She hesitated for a second before continuing. "Mom always told me that you have to take good care of your things." Edward didn't know exactly why, but that simple sentence hit him much harder than he expected. He nodded slowly. She was probably right. Amelia gave him a tiny, shy smile before carefully picking up her heavy bags and heading upstairs to her room. Edward stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching her go, letting out a long, slow breath. He had never, ever pictured himself as a father. He had never even entertained the thought of having a child. He had never imagined having to think about normal things like school districts, children's books, or exactly how many outfits an 8-year-old actually needed. But right now, standing in the middle of his own cavernous house, watching his own flesh and blood settle into a space that was never meant for a child, he profoundly realized something massive. This wasn't just about begrudgingly letting her stay. This was about fiercely ensuring that she never, ever felt like an unwanted burden. And for the absolute first time in his ruthlessly ambitious life, Edward Sterling truly understood that some things in this world are infinitely more important than business. Family was one of them. That evening, the massive house felt undeniably different. It was an incredibly subtle shift, just a slight change in the very air. But the heavy, suffocating silence wasn't nearly as oppressive anymore. Edward wasn't entirely used to the feeling. His home had always been exclusively his domain. Every single detail had been obsessively designed for maximum efficiency and personal comfort, but never for actual warmth. Now, there was a living, breathing child upstairs. His child. And suddenly, the towering, expensive walls felt far less imposing. Edward found himself sitting at the massive desk in his study, desperately trying to catch up on critical corporate work, but the glowing numbers and spreadsheets on his monitors kept blurring together. His mind constantly, relentlessly drifted right back to Amelia. Was she settling in okay? Was she feeling completely out of place? Did she need anything? The simple fact that he honestly didn't know the answers bothered him more than any lost business deal ever could. After several frustrating minutes of failing completely to focus on work, he pushed his heavy chair back and walked out into the long hallway. He stopped hesitantly outside her bedroom door, unsure whether he should knock or just turn around and walk away. Before he could make a decision, the heavy door creaked open slightly. Amelia stood there, looking up at him. She wasn't wearing any of the brand new clothes they had just bought. Instead, she was wearing a slightly faded, oversized t-shirt that clearly must have belonged to her mother. She was clutching one of her new books tightly against her chest, her fingers gripping the edges nervously. "Hi," she said softly. Edward cleared his throat awkwardly. "Hi." She shifted her weight from foot to foot. "I was just going to read for a little bit before going to sleep." He nodded. "That's good." She hesitated, looking down at the floor. "Mom used to read to me sometimes." Those heavy words hung suspended in the thick air between them. Edward felt the crushing weight of them, the loud, unasked question hiding just beneath the surface. "I could read to you," he suddenly found himself offering, before his analytical brain had even fully processed the thought. Amelia looked genuinely shocked, as if she had absolutely never expected him to make an offer like that. She studied his face carefully, then nodded slowly. "Okay." She retreated back to the massive bed, climbing up and pulling the heavy duvet tightly over her legs. Edward followed awkwardly behind her, pulling a sleek designer chair right up next to the bed. She handed the book over to him, her bright blue eyes watching his face intently as he cracked it open. He glanced down at the title. It was a simple children's story, but it carried a profound, deep meaning about finding courage and the long journey home. He began to read aloud. His deep voice was steady and calm, even though he internally wasn't entirely sure if he was doing it the right way. Amelia didn't interrupt him once. She simply listened intently. By the time he reached the end of the 3rd chapter, her heavy eyelids began to aggressively droop. She fought it valiantly, desperately trying to stay awake, but eventually, her breathing leveled out into a soft, rhythmic pattern, and her small hands relaxed their grip on the blankets. Edward sat there in total silence for a long moment, simply watching her sleep. She looked incredibly peaceful, but there was still a very faint, troubled crease between her eyebrows. It was almost as if, even in her sleep, she was terrified that she might wake up and everything would magically disappear again. A tight, painful knot formed deep in his chest. He quietly set the book down on the expensive nightstand, then stood up, gently pulling the heavy covers up over her small shoulders. Before leaving, he hesitated. Then, acting entirely without thinking, he reached out and softly brushed a stray lock of blonde hair away from her forehead. She didn't stir. He took one step back, taking one final, long look at her before flicking off the bedside lamp and stepping silently out of the room. As he gently pulled the heavy door shut behind him, the profound realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about providing her a safe place to sleep. She desperately needed a real home. She needed a family. And for the very first time, Edward knew with absolute certainty that he wasn't just a reluctant guardian caring for a child. He was a father. We are reaching the emotional climax of our story. If you're loving the bond between Edward and Amelia, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss our daily stories. The next morning, Edward woke up much earlier than his usual rigid schedule dictated. His internal clock had always been strictly tuned for maximum corporate efficiency. Early rises and brutally late nights, entirely dedicated to his empire. But today, something fundamental had shifted. He felt absolutely no urgent rush to check his overflowing inbox or prepare for his morning conference calls. Instead, his very first thought instinctively flew to the little girl sleeping down the hall. His daughter. The heavy word still felt slightly alien in his mind, but significantly less so than it had just yesterday. He walked out of his master suite and stopped outside Amelia's door. It was cracked open slightly, and he could hear the faint, soft rustling of movement from inside. He knocked gently on the wood. "Come in," Amelia's tiny voice called out. Edward pushed the door open and found her sitting cross-legged on the expensive rug, meticulously folding the brand-new clothes they had purchased the day before. She was stacking them into perfectly neat, organized piles on the edge of the bed. "You really don't have to do that," he told her gently. "I have a housekeeper who handles all the laundry." Amelia shrugged her shoulders lightly. "I don't mind." She carefully smoothed out an invisible wrinkle on a cotton shirt. Her tiny fingers worked with intense precision, as if completing this one simple task gave her some desperately needed sense of control in a chaotic world. Edward leaned casually against the doorframe. "Did you sleep well?" Amelia nodded brightly. "Yes." She paused, hesitating for a second. "Thank you for reading to me last night." Something tight inside Edward's chest violently squeezed at the quiet, absolute sincerity in her small voice. "You're welcome," he replied softly. "I can do it again tonight, if you'd like." Amelia looked up at him quickly, her bright blue eyes widening in surprise, clearly not expecting a repeat offer. Then, she gave a firm, decisive nod. "Okay." Edward watched her work for another moment before clearing his throat. "You should get something to eat. We need to leave soon." Amelia tilted her blonde head in confusion. Leave to go where? Edward hadn't actually told her the plan yet. He hadn't been entirely sure how she would react to it. But after the profound shift he felt last night, he knew exactly what had to be done. "We are going back to get the rest of your things from Mrs. Gable's house." Amelia blinked rapidly in surprise. "Oh." She sat entirely still, processing the information for a long moment. "Okay." There was absolutely no wild excitement, no massive wave of relief, just a quiet, subdued acceptance. It was as if she had rigorously trained herself to never expect too much out of life. Edward absolutely hated that. "Get ready," he instructed gently. "We're leaving soon." Amelia nodded obediently and immediately went back to folding her clothes. Edward turned around and headed downstairs, making a critical mental note to himself. This trip wasn't just about physically bringing her old belongings to the mansion. It was about firmly proving to her, without a shadow of a doubt, that this massive house was officially her home now. The drive out to Mrs. Gable's neighborhood was quiet. Amelia sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, her small hands resting politely in her lap, her fingers tapping rhythmically against each other. Edward glanced over at her as they pulled up to the modest, slightly run-down duplex in the working-class suburb. It was undeniably warm and inviting, exactly the kind of place where a child would naturally feel safe and loved. Mrs. Gable was already waiting eagerly on the front porch. She was an older, kindly woman, with deep laugh lines around her eyes and a visibly tired but warm smile. The absolute second she laid eyes on Amelia, her entire face softened with pure love. "There's my sweet girl," she called out warmly. Amelia scrambled out of the heavy car, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before practically running up the wooden steps. Mrs. Gable dropped heavily to her knees and pulled the little girl into a fierce, protective hug. Edward stood awkwardly a few feet away, intensely feeling like an absolute intruder intruding on a deeply private, sacred moment he had zero right to interrupt. Mrs. Gable eventually pulled back, gently tucking a stray lock of blonde hair behind Amelia's ear. "Are you doing okay, sweetie?" Amelia nodded earnestly. "Yes." She briefly glanced back over her shoulder at Edward, then looked back at the older woman. "I think so." Mrs. Gable offered a reassuring smile, but her sharp eyes flicked up to lock onto Edward. She studied him with a long, intensely evaluating gaze. "You must be the father." It definitely wasn't phrased as a question. Edward met her piercing gaze head-on and nodded solemnly. "Yes." Mrs. Gable stood up slowly, crossing her arms defensively across her chest. "Lily never actually told you, did she?" Edward's jaw clenched tightly. He slowly shook his head. "No." Mrs. Gable sighed, a heavy, sorrowful sound. "I figured as much. She desperately wanted to. She almost picked up the phone 100 times. She glanced down sadly at Amelia. But she was terrified. She honestly didn't think a man like you would ever want to be a father." Edward let out a long, slow breath, his eyes falling on Amelia. She was sitting quietly on the wooden porch steps, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, listening intently to the adults, but not saying a word. "She still should have told me," Edward stated quietly, but firmly. Mrs. Gable nodded in agreement. "Yes, she absolutely should have." A heavy silence fell between the two adults before the older woman spoke again, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Amelia has been through pure hell, Mr. Sterling. She tragically lost her mother. She lost her home. She's been trying so incredibly hard to be brave, but at the end of the day, she is just a scared little girl." She paused, locking eyes with him again. "She desperately needs you, sir. Probably much more than you even realize." Edward's chest violently constricted under the massive weight of the woman's truth. "I know," he admitted softly. Mrs. Gable studied his face one last time, searching for any sign of deceit, then gave a sharp, satisfied nod, as if she had finally made her decision about him. "Her things are inside. I've already packed up everything she left here." Amelia stood up quickly. "I can go get it." Edward immediately stepped forward. "We will go get it together." Amelia blinked up at him in surprise, but she didn't argue. The inside of the small house smelled strongly of warm baking spices and old wood. It was clearly a home where deep memories lived in every single corner. Edward couldn't help but notice the numerous framed photographs heavily lining the hallway walls, many of Mrs. Gable's own family, but quite a few prominently featuring a smiling Amelia and her mother. She had been deeply, fiercely loved here. They carried out a single battered duffel bag containing her meager possessions. It wasn't much at all, just some worn clothes, a few beloved stuffed animals, and one carefully framed photograph of Lily. When the bag was securely packed into the trunk of the Maybach, Mrs. Gable crouched down in front of Amelia one last time. "You have my phone number, sweetheart. You can call me absolutely anytime you want, okay?" Amelia nodded bravely. "Okay." Her small face remained remarkably composed, but Edward clearly saw the way her tiny fists clenched tightly at her sides. She was forcefully bottling up her turbulent emotions, exactly the same unhealthy way he always did. Mrs. Gable smiled softly, tears shining in her eyes. "Take good care of yourself." Amelia swallowed hard, then threw her arms around the older woman's neck in a desperate, tight hug. Edward politely turned his back, giving them the privacy they deserved for their final goodbye. When Amelia finally climbed back into the luxurious car, she let out a long, shaky breath, turning her head to stare blankly out the tinted window. The long drive back to the massive estate was even quieter than the drive there. Edward wasn't entirely sure if he should try to break the silence, but after a long, heavy pause, Amelia spoke first. "She took really good care of me," she whispered softly. Edward nodded slowly, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the road ahead. "I can definitely see that." The silence returned, stretching out for miles. Then, Amelia slowly turned her head to look directly at him. "Are you going to take really good care of me too?" Edward felt the innocent question hit him squarely in the chest, like a physical blow. He looked over at her, at the desperate way she was trying to sound casual, completely failing to hide the terrifying vulnerability shaking her voice. "Yes," he answered, absolutely zero hesitation in his deep voice. "I will." Amelia held his steady gaze for a long, searching moment before finally nodding. She didn't say another word for the rest of the trip, but her rigid posture noticeably relaxed against the leather seat. And for the very first time, Edward genuinely felt that maybe, just maybe, she was actually starting to believe him. That evening, Edward caught himself doing something he had literally never done before in his entire life. He walked right past his home office without stopping. His expensive laptop remained completely untouched on the mahogany desk. His corporate inbox was overflowing with supposedly urgent emails, but not a single one of them felt important anymore. His entire focus was entirely somewhere else. Amelia was quietly in her room, carefully unpacking the battered duffel bag she had brought from Mrs. Gable's house. She had been notably quiet since they returned to the mansion, but it wasn't the same terrified silence from before. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the thoughtful silence of someone actively trying to process their brand new reality. Edward hesitated briefly outside her door before knocking softly. "Come in," Amelia called out. He pushed the door open and looked around the space. The massive guest room still didn't look like a real child's room. It was far too perfectly polished, far too sterile and impersonal. But Amelia had carefully arranged her worn stuffed animals on top of the expensive duvet and prominently placed the framed photograph of her smiling mother on the bedside table. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, an open book resting in her lap, though she clearly wasn't reading it. "Getting settled in?" Edward asked softly. Amelia shrugged lightly. "I guess so." He casually leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "I was thinking, maybe tomorrow we could go out and buy some real things for this room. Try to make it feel a little more like it belongs to you." Amelia looked up sharply. Her bright blue eyes were filled with deep hesitation. "Like what kind of things?" "I don't really know," he admitted honestly, a slight, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "What do you want? A new desk? Different bedding? Maybe some posters for the walls?" Amelia nervously chewed on her lower lip. "I've never actually had my own room before." Edward frowned deeply. "You shared a room with your mom?" She nodded. "It was really small, but it was nice." He slowly looked around the cavernous, cold room that had been architecturally designed for wealthy guests who practically never visited. "Well, this entire room is yours now, so you should absolutely decorate it to make it feel like yours." Amelia thought about his words very carefully for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Okay," Edward exhaled, relieved. "Good." She hesitated, looking at the blank walls. Can we buy some paint?" He raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You want to completely paint the walls?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Mom, let me help pick out the color for our old apartment." Edward had literally never given a single conscious thought to the color of the walls in his mansion. They were all neutral, perfectly muted, obsessively curated by an absurdly expensive interior designer. But right now, standing in this room, he profoundly realized for the first time that his own aesthetic preferences didn't matter in the slightest. "What color do you want?" he asked gently. Amelia tilted her head, tapping her chin thoughtfully. "Blue." Edward let out a quiet chuckle. "Expected." The corners of Amelia's mouth twitched upward, clearly fighting a huge smile. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke again. "Are you still going to read to me tonight?" Edward blinked. He had offered to do it again, but he genuinely hadn't expected it to instantly become a nightly routine. Yet now, looking down at her hopeful face, eagerly waiting for his answer, he realized he didn't mind the idea at all. In fact, he actually wanted to. "Yes," he said warmly. "Pick out whichever book you want." Amelia nodded happily, immediately reaching for the book she had been holding earlier, and scrambled quickly up into the massive bed. Edward comfortably took his seat in the chair right next to her, opening to the exact page she had carefully bookmarked. He began reading aloud. His deep voice was steady and incredibly soothing, and as the fictional story filled the quiet room, the rigid tension completely melted out of Amelia's posture. By the time he finally reached the end of the second chapter, she was blinking much slower. Her breathing deepened into a soft, steady rhythm. Edward quietly closed the book, but he didn't rush to leave. He sat completely still, just watching her sleep. He watched her tiny hands resting softly on top of the blanket, and he looked at the framed photo of Lily sitting nearby, standing there like a silent, protective guardian. For so many years, Edward had arrogantly believed that his life was full and complete. He truly thought that his massive financial success, his undeniable power, and his obsessively controlled world were more than enough. But now, sitting in the quiet dark and watching his beautiful daughter sleep, he realized a profound truth. His life hadn't been complete at all. It had been desperately waiting to begin. And finally, it had. This story is not just a tale about a billionaire unexpectedly discovering he has a child. It is a profound narrative about redemption, taking responsibility, and the incredibly unexpected ways that life forces us to confront our own pasts. Edward Sterling begins as a man who firmly believes he possesses everything a person could ever want: wealth, extreme power, and absolute control. But in reality, he is deeply, tragically alone. His entire existence is structured as a defense mechanism to avoid real emotional connection. When Amelia suddenly appears, the protective walls he built around himself instantly begin to crumble. What makes this journey so incredibly powerful is not just the shocking revelation of his daughter, but his slow, deliberate transformation into a true father. He doesn't magically change overnight. There are real doubts, awkward moments, and deep hesitation. But day after day, he actively chooses Amelia. Not out of legal obligation, but out of genuine love. Amelia is a child who has lost almost everything. She is incredibly cautious, terrified to believe that Edward will actually stay. She demands very little, but her quiet, desperate hope is the emotional engine driving the story. She doesn't need a perfect billionaire. She just desperately needs someone who absolutely refuses to leave. The true beauty of this ending lies in its quiet simplicity. Reading a bedtime story, planning to paint a room blue, promising that she is finally home. These tiny, seemingly insignificant moments powerfully demonstrate that true love isn't about massive, grand gestures. It is about consistency and presence. Ultimately, this is a story about second chances. Sometimes, life hands you exactly what you never knew you needed. Edward didn't just find a daughter. He found the single missing piece of his own soul. And for the very first time in his life, he finally understands what it truly means to be rich. Thank you so much for watching and experiencing this incredible story with us. If Edward and Amelia's journey touched your heart, please like the video, leave a comment, sharing your favorite moment, and subscribe to our channel for more deep, emotional stories every single week. See you in the next one.